Delegations from Turkey, Russia, Ukraine and the United Nations are to meet this week to discuss the safe export of Ukrainian grain. Commonly called one of the world's key bread baskets, Ukraine supplied 10% of global wheat exports last year. With global hunger levels reaching new highs, concerns are rising over an international food crisis. Many are expecting a deal to be made that would help secure the passage of millions of tons of grain through the Black Sea. But what hurdles need to be cleared? What's at stake? I'm joined by Professor Sheng from the School of Advanced Agriculture of Peking University. Professor Sheng, thank you very much for joining us. So the meeting that I'm talking about is mainly about Ukraine's export of grain, including the shipment of about 22 million tons of grain stuck because of the war. And the Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar said an expected deal would include joint controls for checking ships in harbors and Turkey ensuring the safety of Black Sea export routes. Help us understand the extent of the problem concerning the export of Ukraine's grain first.
Oh, thank you for your question. I think, the global supply chain is very essential for international food trade. This is in particular important for the food export from Ukraine to the rest of the world. Now, since the early part of this year, because of the conflict in the region, you can see that a lot of trade actually has been stopped. Now, in this type of situation, how to maintain the supply side? Through improving the efficiency of this logistics through the sea transportation is essential in this case. Now, the efforts made, in particular, from the neighborhood countries, actually will help to resolve this type of situation. A good example was that, since the early 2020, when COVID-19 comes in, even the direct impact is not on the supply side, but affect this type of supply chain. It caused a huge increase in terms of the food price in the international market. So I would say that, given the current situation, the efforts from different, countries, including like Turkey and others, who are actually trying to help to smooth this type of reducing the transportation cost will help to reduce the pressure on the food price in the international market. Yeah.
We are joined also by Dr. Tang Kiwi, founder of Waveney Economics, joining me from Singapore. So welcome, Dr. Tang. We understand that Ukraine and Russia produce almost a third of the world's wheat and barley and half of its sunflower oil. Russia and Belarus are the world's number 2 and number 3 producers of potash, a key ingredient of fertilizer. And the war is expected to still be a long way to go. So Dr. Tan, how do you view the repercussions of the conflict on global food safety? And 5 months we've seen the conflict dragging on. Is the situation still getting worse?
Well, it's going to be prolonged for a while, as long as the sanctions imposed by Europe and the US continue in Russia. Because once the sanctions are there, the natural gas prices will remain high. Natural gas prices actually are used to make fertilizers. Actually, the wheat prices have come down. It used to be about 1,200. Now it's back to about 800, around near when the conflict in Ukraine started. But that's one thing. It is a bigger problem. Food crisis is something that the world has been facing. And it boils down to 3 other factors. Number one, there's too much money around and the money is not distributed equally. So the poor are not getting the money that they need to buy. Secondly, actually there's enough land to grow grains for the world. It's just that all the market forces channel these grains to make alternative fuels or to do other things, and the world cannot afford. Yeah, and of course the third thing is COVID has made things disrupted the supply chain.
Professor Shen, according to the UN, in the past year, global food prices have risen by nearly 1/3. Fertilizer price has grown by more than half, and oil prices by almost 2/3. Can you help us further clarify the picture? What does that really mean for the people, especially in developing countries, who are getting hit the worst?
Generally, from economic perspective, we would say that the impact that has been occurred because of the current conflict is mainly coming, two channels. One is that actually it will directly affect the supply of the food, as what we discussed just now. On the second part of things, we will say that because of the conflict, which is affecting the input prices, this also will cause the producer, to increase the producer cost. Now, in this particular, sense, actually, the supply of the food will be reduced to some extent. Although, we can say that this general impact would be roughly being, reduced by other countries increasing their supply. But this impact on the expectation would be, to some extent, in short term, would be heavy. Now, if we treat this thing as one perspective, the other thing that we want to, explore this issue for developing countries in particular. Now, generally speaking, that throughout the whole world perspective, supply and demand side actually is roughly equal. From a general perspective.
Okay.
However, in global food trade, developing countries always in disadvantaged situation. Most of the developing countries, because the high population intensity, that their domestic supply couldn't feed for the domestic demand. So this made it, the food trade has been mainly dominated by exporting for developed countries to developing countries. So in this sense, you can see that both impact will impose more restriction on the food trade, and thus impose more negative impact on developing countries' food supply, in particular from international market.
Yeah. Yes. A joint statement, Dr. Tan, a joint statement was released on July the 15th by several international organizations calling for urgent action and immediate support to the vulnerable. It cites figures from the World Food Programme, for instance. By June this year, the number of acute food insecure people increased to 345 million around the world. That's more than doubling the pre-pandemic levels. How serious is the situation, and how much hope can we give to the deal that's being discussed between Turkey, Russia, Ukraine and the United Nations to smooth out, let's say, the exports of Ukrainian grain?
Well, the grains might start to export outside, but it's just that the situation is acute. A recent satellite photo shows that all the wheat producing regions of the world are going to be underperforming this year, except two countries because of favorable weather, and that's Russia. So this crisis is going to continue. We can't run away from it. I think the problem is because, over the years, the past decades, we've been through globalization, we've been specializing. So a lot of these poor countries should have been growing their own staple food, but they are not. They are relying on other countries, and that's now the problem is multiplied.
So basically a short-term problem compounded by longer-term issues. What is the impact of sanctions? How big of an impact have the sanctions been, Dr. Tan?
Sanctions on Russia, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, well, the Ukraine says that they cannot get their grains out of all the port in Odessa, but Russia is saying it's not the case. It depends on which media you read. It's because actually the sea, the Black Seas are actually still mined by the Ukraine. So Russia is actually trying to get these mines, get Ukrainians to remove the mines so that the ships can start flowing. I think we are doing that now. They are already doing that. They are doing that now. So probably the problem will be eased in the next few months.
The United States issued a fact sheet, Professor Sheng, on July the 14th, which clarifies that certain types of transactions related to agricultural commodities and agricultural equipment, as well as medicine and medical devices, are not targets of U.S. sanctions on Russia. So what kind of effects do you think U.S. sanctions on Russia have had on the shortage of food situation, and has the United States realized that the sanctions are also probably hurting themselves as well a little bit?
As just now, Professor Tang has mentioned that, the direct impact of this war on the food supply throughout the whole world on two sides. One is the directly negative impact on the production and supply of the current produced food. The other side actually is the sanction itself, because the sanction will cause the limited or restricted export from the second largest country, which is, food supply, in the region, which is Russia, not only in terms of the food itself, but also in terms of these, intermediate inputs like fertilizer and other things. Now, as you can see that if there is more consideration that it can be, put into the current negotiation, in particular, that, those necessities, I would say the necessities for, food production and supply type of things can be exempted from this sanction. It will not only help to relax the current short-term constraint, but also will generate more longer period of impact, in particular, to meet the demand and supply sets throughout the world.
Finally, Dr. Tan, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres admitted the first meeting in weeks between Russia and Ukraine took a critical step forward last Wednesday, but cautioned that more technical work will still be needed to reach an agreement. How much could a deal, if reached, help ease the current shortage of grain and food around the world?
I think it will need ease a bit, because I feel that the West will continue to sanction Russia, and gas prices will remain high. And gas prices remain high, fertilizers and all the things that you depend on fertilizers will remain high. So I see that this food crisis will continue for probably another a year at least.
That's your prediction. Okay, we will keep a close watch on the situation. Many thanks to our guests, Dr. Tang Kiwi, founder of Waveney Economics, and Professor Sheng from the School of Advanced Agriculture at Peking University.